Hey, Liam.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you well.
Okay, excellent. All right. Thanks for taking this debate at such short notice. Uh, so,
Yeah, sure.
so the way I think we should do this is I'll first just explain what I think the reasonable interpretation of this assumed technology is. If you have any objections to that, point those out. Then I'll make my case, you make your case, and then we'll go into like a back and forth cross examination type thing.
Sure, sounds good. I don't have I'll say right away, I don't have a strong case. I'm mostly going to respond and challenge the ideas in yours, but we'll see how it goes.
Yep, no problem. Okay, so the technology. So obviously, this is a little bit of a futuristic debate. So I think we should just think of it like a pill that will remove violent urgencies or tendencies or thoughts from those convicted of violent crimes. Obviously, we wouldn't administer it to people who are just convicted of one crime, but there would have to be a demonstrable trend of crimes that are occurring, so we can assure that their mindset is the thing that is making them commit those crimes. And I think for the purpose of the debate, we can assume that it's painless and there's no side effects. However, this is, of course, something that the criminal does not get to consent to. That is to say, by court order, they would just, but in the same way that there's like chemical castration in some areas of the world, this would be another form of punishment or rehabilitation that the criminal justice system can put down. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Sure, I don't think I have any objection to those ideas.
Okay, awesome. So I'll make two arguments then. Firstly, why this is a just imposition that the criminal justice system is allowed to do. And secondly, how this is better for the way society interacts with criminals and how criminals re-interact with society when they end their term in prison, for example. So to the first argument, why we think this is a just imposition. So, firstly, the criminal justice system is based on protecting society and ensuring that the rehabilitation of criminals such that after they break the law, they're unlikely to re-break that law. And that means that we're allowed to violate people's rights already under the status quo in the service of protecting others. So we violate people's right to vote or freedom of movement or freedom of association after they've committed a crime in order to protect the rights of everyone else in the society. So the burden I have then is to demonstrate that this violation of their right to their mind is something that is just. So to the first reason why I think that's true, I think it helps protect society, which is one of the mandates of the criminal justice system. It protects society by preventing future crimes from being committed. That is to say, if the urge to be violent was the causal nexus for them committing a crime, that goes away. Therefore, there's no reason for them to commit those violent crimes in the future. And secondly, even if that's not true, it makes people feel a lot safer, which is actually really, really important, because people act in the way on that they feel. So, for example, a little kid who's scared of the dark acts as if there's actually a monster in their room, even if they rationally know there isn't, because they act on how they feel. That's also why there's things like theater security when you go to like the airport and they check people's shoes and make you take off their belt. It actually doesn't make the place safer, but it makes everyone feel safer, and that means that people act in a more safe and rational way. The second part of this is, how does it rehabilitate those people? Obviously, as is the premise of the motion, they're unlikely to recommit those crimes, which I guess is kind of like definitionally rehabilitation. But more importantly, you don't really consent to the violent urges that you're born with or the lusts that you may have for a certain sex or any of your other personality quirks. And some of these personality quirks are bad. In this case, that is the tendency to be violent. This relieves them of that harm, is something that they didn't consent to, which means that they don't have to carry around the burden of knowing that they're a violent person or a person who has anger issues for the rest of their life. I think that's a pretty reasonable thing. Importantly, this is actually no different to what the criminal justice system does right now. That is to say, when we try and rehabilitate people and counsel them and stuff, that is still trying to change their brain and try to change their mind in the way in which they see the world. This is just a simpler and more effective and painless way to do it that works 100% of the time. That is the reason why I think it's just. Second argument, why this helps society engage with criminals. So the first thing is that right now there's very little support for criminals in general because they have broken the law and very few voters are sympathetic to those individuals. I think this changes the way they see them, because now they see that they can be like brought back into the fold and become law-abiding citizens because of this technology, which means they're likely to be more sympathetic to their reintegration in the future. They're more likely to advocate for better prison conditions, or they're more likely to just rehire them because, as I identified before, they know that they're safe or they're not afraid of them, which means when they come out of prison, they're less likely to have to fall back into crime because there's a society that's more willing than the status quo to accept them. So those are the reasons why I believe it's probably better for society as well. So I'll pass over to you and tell me what you think.
Okay, sure. I'm going to approach this mostly by asking questions. So we'll have a little bit more of a dialogue, but I'm going to try to follow some of your points. There's a little bit of feedback coming from your computer. I'm not sure what the deal is, but it's better. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, 1 second. I forgot to plug in my earphones.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm just hearing myself. That always makes it a little more harder to talk. I'm like, wait, I'm responding to myself. How strange. Okay, so I'm curious. My understanding is that you think that this technology is going to reduce violent impulses. So this would have an effect on the person who's kind of a crazy madman, primarily like a psychopathic person or a schizophrenic person. And it seems to underline the idea that anger or violent urges are the primary source of violent crime. Is that the case, or is this more just sort of a magic bullet that we don't know how it solves these problems, but it just sort of solves all these problems?
So there's a little bit of a... Sorry, can you hear me with the earphones?
I can, yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. So I agree there are lots of causes for crime. Another example might be socioeconomic status or necessity for crime. But I think a lot of crimes are reactionary or crimes of opportunity. And to do that, you need to be in a heightened emotional state. This makes it you unable or less likely to reach that heightened emotional state, and therefore the threshold for you committing a crime, even though there are other factors, is harder to reach, and therefore you're less likely to commit a crime.
Okay. Sounds good. So with that clarification, let's move on to, I'm going to flow through your points, and then I think I've got some sort of my own questions, which I'll extend, we can talk about as well. So in response, under the heading of it being just, it violates the rights. Violating rights is part of the status quo, and I would agree with that. However, my response would be that not all rights are violated when people are incarcerated. Obviously, the right to freedom of association, in some cases, free speech is limited. But generally speaking, the criteria is that the limitations of the freedoms of the prisoner are restricted to those that are useful in order to uphold the law. And to enact appropriate punishment. But we have, of course, in America at least, a prohibition against what's called cruel and unusual punishment, which would be, cover things that are purely vindictive or we would consider barbaric or, socially inappropriate as activities for anyone. I wouldn't feed my dog that food. So we have to give prisoners reasonable nutrition, something that's not, that's relatively palatable. We have to make sure that they're cared for health-wise, because these are not supposed to be death sentences. They're just restrictions of your freedom. So I would challenge us to ask you to come up with some justification how specifically this limitation, which would be an alteration of your brain, of your character as a person, is justified with respect as to the alternative, which is simply to keep people in prison or to use typical psychological counseling in order to modify their behavior or encourage them to modify their behavior, right? So that's what I'm going to be looking for a little bit in response to that. Let's go ahead and just sort of go back and forth on each point a little bit, and then move on to the next one.
Oh, okay. So you'd like me to respond to that?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay. Awesome. So I've got two responses. Both of them were actually built into my case that I started with at the beginning. So your claim is that not all rights should be violated. There are some rights that should not be violated. But the criteria that you assess those with is whether or not they're meaningful in upholding the law. And so obviously my case thus far has demonstrated that they're less likely to have people commit crimes or are more likely to have them reintegrated into society. So it does meet that criteria. However, I think in the status quo, we actually do lots of things that are very akin to this right now. That is to say, to control people in an institution that is prison, there has to be some degree of institutionalization. They get told when to eat, when to drink, when to go to sleep, when to go out to the courts. That does change the way in which a person's mind functions. This isn't really meaningfully different. But let's take the best case. Let's say like a Scandinavian prison where you get like TVs and but a lot of freedom is just basically like a pen that you're separated from the rest of society. There are still rehabilitation methods that still do this. And the reason that is the whole purpose of rehabilitation is to change the way in which a person is thinking and thus change their actions. Now, counselors do this right now with lots of time and pain and trying to get this person to deal with their issues. This is just a really quick and efficient and painless way of doing it that solves the problem.
So, however, if we're going to consider the weighing, so you're saying this is an easy system, it's convenient for the state. However, when we have a consideration of a value of personal autonomy and freedom and that sort of thing, right, which many of us have and think is important. We don't like to be controlled by other people. We don't want to become puppets of the state. To give the state the power to automatically change who we are as a character seems a pretty dramatic step. And the only thing that we are gaining from it is greater efficiency. So if we have mechanisms that can already change people's behavior, and if that's already considered a reasonable activity, why there has to be some meaningful difference as to why we would be scared of this other process, which I think it's non-voluntary, right? So those other methods of altering somebody's behavior are interactive. They require buy-in and participation from the person. While they may change their character over time, it's a self-generated change to a degree led by other people. As where this is some kind of chemical that really degrades our capability of having these particular types of emotions. So it wouldn't necessarily make us a better person. It would just make us incapable of being as bad a person as we were before, if I understand it correctly. So I guess I would challenge as to whether or not there is enough of a difference. And if there is enough of a difference, that highlights the moral objection to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. Well, there's actually an enormous difference. If you look at the recidivism rates in places like Australia or America, they're very, very high, which indicates that current systems are not working. This is a way that fixes that. Additionally, it's not just efficiency. Like, yes, it is faster. That's like the efficiency thing I said, in the sense that they spend less time in prison. That's super important. That's less time away from your family. That's less time away if you have kids, or if you've got a partner at home, that they're just not surviving on a single income anymore, but then you can help provide for them. The emotional support of having a loved one in prison and you having to go visit them is pretty taxing on a lot of people. Additionally, it's also successful. So even though there are systems in the status quo, you identified there's a voluntary component of it. That's true. I agree. My system is significantly less voluntary. That's the point of the debate. But your system simply doesn't work, or it doesn't work very well for the vast majority of people. Additionally, your system doesn't also help integration, because the reason why people don't want to reintegrate prisoners or hire prisoners is because they're worried that they're going to reoffend again. Even if they say someone is fully rehabilitated and there's no chance that they'll ever commit a crime again, or they're still tarnished with the brand of being a prisoner. Whereas when I can say to everyone that all of these prisoners never ever going to commit a crime again of a violent nature because of this thing that we've provided them, it means that your interactions with prisoners, you're going to think all of them are not going to hurt you. You're more likely to hire them. You're less likely to discriminate against them, which means that even if I agree there is a loss to personal autonomy here, absolutely, but there's already a huge loss to personal autonomy under the status quo in prison, and then post-prison, there's still an enormous loss of personal autonomy because no one wants to interact with you. This fixes that problem.
I think if we grant the efficacy of this, that it is significantly better, you have to drop your claim that we're already doing something analogous to this, that the current methodology of counseling and therapy that's in prison is morally analogous. I don't think it is. I don't think you can make that claim that it's something we're already doing. I think you have to drop that if you want to accept the idea that it is fundamentally and significantly more effective in changing behavior. That just seems that those two things don't go together. Yeah.
I agree they're not perfectly analogous, but the question I would ask is, say you had a prisoner and you perfectly rehabilitated them. Would the end state of them be any different from a person who now no longer has those violent urges?
I don't know. I mean, the technology would have some specific claim to it. But let's say that their behavior would be the same, whether or not the nature of the person themselves would be the same is a different question. Maybe they still have violent urges, but they've learned coping mechanisms, cognitive therapy in order to change their behaviors, even though they still have those impulses. I mean, that's the way most of us in civil society operate. It's not that we don't have anger or don't have the desire to throttle somebody on the street that's making our lives difficult. It's that we have the cognitive ability to control those behaviors, recognizing that they would destroy our lives rather than give us satisfaction in that situation, right? So I think we're talking about a bit of a fundamentally different kind of fix. So I'm move on to the next point. I'm willing to grant that it is superior to the status quo, but I think in doing so, you have to accept that it is a fundamentally different kind of an operation than a counseling. So you'd have to lose that point. But let's talk a little bit about the removal of these violent urges. You talked about people in society understanding that this would make these criminals safer, more readily acceptable as normal people. But I would also posit there's a possible disadvantage that they could really become effectively slaves to other people. You're creating a system of essentially chemically castrating people's ability to resist others' aggression. So you're making these people incapable of rising to a level of anger in order to defend themselves or even perhaps their rights. An employer could be terribly abusive, sexually abusive perhaps, or take other actions that would normally result in a strong defensive mechanism. But these people who have lost the ability to rise to that level of anger or emotional heighten may well be unable to defend themselves in these kinds of situations. So you're essentially creating kind of a class of slave that's had their minds zombified to some degree. Is there something in this solution that would prevent that?
Yeah, obviously you're not making them impossible to get angry. We're just reducing them to the threshold that they would not commit a crime. So, for example, I can get angry, but that doesn't mean I go over the anger to commit the crime. And this is the threshold of violence to commit a crime. But even if you think that's like really hard to define and I'm just bullshitting.
Yes. It is hard to define.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree it's hard to define, but also it's hard to imagine a technology in which you would remove people's ability to get to, remove anger anyway.
Sure. But if you could, to me, it would be a blanket threshold that just stops a heightened emotion. We'd become more Spock-like, perhaps, but maybe we'd become more sheep-like.
I agree it's probably hard to define. I think that we could probably get somewhere close to the threshold, but even if we could get like within an error from the threshold, if every criminal is like that, right? Every ex-prisoner is like that, and then everyone else in society is not committing crimes, then they have no need to defend themselves because regular citizens don't commit crimes, and now ex-prisoners don't commit crimes. So it seems like, what's the harm if no one's like threatening them?
Right, but we're only talking about crimes of violence here, crimes of anger and passion, crimes of criminality and theft. Corporate crime, slavery is not a crime of passion. It's a crime of property and a crime of justice. And so there's nothing to stop people who are very cold and calculating, who are entirely rational, from continuing to commit crimes of various kinds. And these new class of ex-criminals who, let's face it, most of the people who commit violent crimes in a rash way, a lot of them are poor, disadvantaged, are now going to become sheep people, right, that are out on the street, possibly, that could be taken advantage of by these other criminals, this other class of criminals, which this solution doesn't really address, but who commit cold, calculating crimes purely for the sake of self-advantage and not out of passion or anger.
So let me just ask some questions. Can crimes be committed because of violent urges or like heightened emotional state? Yeah. And can you react to defend yourself in a crime from heightened emotional states? Which is the premise. That's what you're arguing.
I would think, heightened emotional states are always going to result when you're being the victim of a violent crime, in as much as when you're perpetrating one.
Yeah, so it can be both used as the offensive tool and the defensive tool, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So you also think that some crimes can be committed by someone who's cold and calculating?
Yes.
Okay, why is it that you can't defend yourself from a crime by being cold and calculating or calm or going to the authorities or just saying no?
It's a good question. My posited theory is that part of our ability to defend ourselves is based on our emotional impulses. So when we're victimized, when somebody's taking advantage of us, we have an emotional response of victimhood, of being oppressed, of anger is usually one, at least for many men, is one of our first responses. Fear is also a response, and fear is often a motivator in many crimes of passion. So fear and anger are, in many ways, are defensive emotional states that help us recognize danger and react to it. The fight or flight response, as you may have heard it. And so this same response, these same emotional impulses are those that are involved often in violent crimes and crimes of passion, are also involved in defending ourselves and trying to stay alive in the face of aggression.
Yeah, I agree. But what I'm saying is that say someone tries to attack you. Do you think the optimum response is to have the defense of heightened emotional awareness as opposed to being cold and calculating?
It's an interesting question. I don't know. I think it can be helpful. It could be helpful to be cold and calculating in some situations, but then again, because none of us have really experienced this, it's hard for us to say. But I can easily imagine, and I think it not improbable, that robbed of our ability to reach heightened emotional states, we might simply accept victimization in many situations because we wouldn't feel angry about it. If we don't feel angry, if we don't feel frightened, why should we do anything? We just simply accept it.
Yeah. So that's the premise of your argument. I was just confirming that you think that in some situations, anger is the best and or only way to respond. Is what you're saying?
I think it's the natural way to respond, and if robbed of it, we may not even have a motivation to protect ourselves. I mean, we may have a cold, calculating self-interest, but let's say if you just come into the office and smack me in the morning, right? Am I really like wounded by this smacking, right, activity? No, mostly I feel angry and embarrassed, right? But if you've taken away my ability to feel angry and embarrassed, I might well go, "Oh, Jim is slapping me again today. That's lovely." Yeah. Now maybe that's happy for me, but really it speaks to us as a kind of exploitation. And yeah, I mean, it would allow, like I said, and then who knows what's the limit of what we could do with these people? They become this kind of class of slaves or sheeple, as I would call them.
So precisely my point is that, so you're saying that there's a certain subset of crimes that you need anger or fear to defend yourself with. I'm saying that I'd refer you to what I said back earlier, that if people are still being violent, then that is cause for the criminal justice system to lock them up and then give them this medication. And then people who are not committing those crimes don't need it. So it seems to me that of the people who are still committing crimes, I don't have to be
angry to slap you, right? I could just be imperious, right? I mean,
you can be violent.
There's a whole class of crimes. I mean, this isn't a panacea for all crimes. It's supposed to be a panacea for violent crimes.
Yes.
Street thugs and guys on the street raping and murdering and killing, which is certainly a portion of crime, especially like gang violence and stuff tends to be a lot of that. So I acquiesce that it is a significant portion of crime, but I would maintain it is by no means the lion's share or necessarily the bulk of crime that happens, violent crime.
I've got a great analogy actually. Oh, all right. Okay. What this is requiring, it's requiring some citizens to give up a defensive tool such that it's less likely that another group of people or they themselves will use it as an offensive tool later. And that tool is the violent urges or anger and other synonyms. What about guns are functionally the same thing. Guns can be used defensively and offensively, and people give up their right to control it such that they are protected in a scenario. Yes, that does mean that individuals remaining with guns do have a vastly larger comparative advantage. That is to say, you're like the one who gets slapped. You don't have the ability to defend yourself. But that's an argument to enforce the law against the person who's using the gun or the tool of anger or violence, not an argument to say that we should allow everyone to have those weapons.
I suppose it depends on your perspective of what matters, your own personal autonomy or a greater societal impact, right? So that's sort of a value judgment. I'm going to leave it there for the moment, move on to another subject. So if we have this technology, what's to stop us from saying, for instance, that why not everybody take this pill so that none of us have the capability of committing crimes of passion? Why wait for them to happen? Why wait for people to be recidivists or show multiple crimes? If there's no real harm to this, if it's not a great dramatic or an unreasonable reduction of rights, why not administer this to everyone?
Well, a couple of reasons for that. The first one is that this is a preemptive restriction. So to start off with, if you're going to argue that it should go to everyone, then that also wins the pro side of the debate, because everyone includes those who have committed violent crimes. So I don't think that's a winning strategy.
Right, but I'm asking you whether or not you advocate that.
Well, I'm fine with that. I am, but that's not what I'm arguing for. So let me provide reasons to believe why this specific group is the one that should be receiving it. So, like, if we had to triage the order in which we gave them out, I'm preferencing this group. The first one is that it is as we've both identified, it is a restriction of rights to some degree. These are people who have committed an action, which means that it's more legitimate for us to restrict their rights in the same way we restrict their freedom of movement, that those people are like preferentially going to be given this drug. Secondly, those are the people who most need it. So, for example, there are people who are like very calm and non-confrontational. Like, they're not going to change because of this medicine, but these people are going to change. Thus, these are the ones who need to be given it first, and thus you should focus on them. I had another one. Thirdly, is that, as I identified in my first argument, those individuals, and this also responds to the bodily autonomy argument, is that, yes, it is a violation of bodily autonomy. I'm not saying that it's not. I'm saying it's a just violation of bodily autonomy, because another violation of bodily autonomy is having these anger and violent tendencies to begin with. Like, you don't consent to the brain that you have or the way in which you're born. For example, you don't consent to have brown hair or black hair or blue eyes or green eyes. But those things define your life in the same way that your personality defines your life, which is part of what you're born with. This is relieving them of this thing that would harm them in society.
But very few people argue that, because I was born with brown hair and blonde hair is considered more attractive, that gives anyone else the right to change my hair color because they've decided that it would be better for me. So I think the idea that you can involuntarily change somebody and that is justified by the fact that it is for their better is just sort of antithetical to, principles of liberty and libertarianism. Which are kind of foundational for both our countries' legal systems.
It is better for them, but the primary argument is that it's better for everyone else, right? Like, say,
we don't use that as justification either. I mean, you could say that to change somebody to be less lazy, right? So we have a ray gun here that can make people not lazy people. So we shoot them with it so that they let's say it's just full of methamphetamines or something. We shoot them with it and it makes them work a lot harder. We don't let people do that, right? Because we have a sense of bodily autonomy and individual freedom that we don't violate just for the public good. We only do it when it is a direct danger to other people, right?
That's usually like people with violent tendencies directly endanger other people.
So let me bring some things around here. I do have one more point to make later, but let me construct that. I'm putting forth various problems and difficulties with this. It's considered an unusual step to change people's identity in order to change their behavior involuntarily and in a manner that's controlling. We have some concerns about creating another class of citizen that is easily exploited and is somebody that we can exploit and use to our benefit. Which creates, all kinds of potential for social change that is somewhat unsavory, all for the sake of trying to create, a better world in which we have less repeat violent offenders when we have other alternatives, which is to keep people in prison until they've sufficiently altered their behavior in some way, shape, or form, which may be slightly less effective, but doesn't have these other trade-offs. So we're really looking at a trade-off scenario, and it's a question of what an individual finds more valuable, the extreme cases of crime, and whether or not we can reduce some of that of recidivism rates, or do we want to, tamper with people's cognitive abilities and minds, open up the gate of whether or not it's worth a positive good in order to sort of mind control people and to create subservient, non-angry, non-fearful class of citizens in our society who used to have committed some kind of activity but don't. So you want to weigh these benefits, right? So I'm going to grant you that this chemical criminal castration would be more effective than normal counseling. But is it worth the disadvantages when we have this other alternative, which is prison, which is perhaps more expensive, but more humane and questions less of our fundamental ideals? The last thing I want to ask is, are they still culpable? So if someone commits their second violent crime and you feed them this drug, and now we know that they would never commit a crime like that again, are they still culpable of the crime, or have they become a person who's no longer responsible for what they did?
You're obviously responsible for your past actions.
So you would still have to serve your prison sentences. Just when your prison sentence was over, you would then be subject to this sort of emotional castration.
Well. Obviously, this would entail a changing of the criminal justice system, because one of the reasons why prison sentences are so long is so that people, like the rest of society, feels safe. They think like a murderer deserves to go away for 50 years or some number like that. And the reason is partially because what they think they did was wrong, and that's true, but mostly because they don't want that person out in the community and potentially recommitting. This stops those recommitting, which means sentences are shorter or less or better. They're like, people advocate for prisoners' rights more because they're more sympathetic towards them, which means less people suffer.
Yeah, I mean, although we're positing a technology, we're not necessarily positing people's attitudes. And I would wonder greatly whether people would be convinced that a pill is actually going to change somebody's soul. I mean, there's religious reasons why people think that the mind and the body are essentially dualistic in nature, and that no amount of chemistry is going to change somebody from good to evil or vice versa. And also, I think a lot of people are distrustful of science. People don't believe in vaccines. They don't believe in global warming. They don't believe in anything that doesn't fit their worldview.
All right,
certainly, maybe in Australia it's a little different than America, but here,
let me stop you. Yeah, look, believe it or not, the entire world's not America, and Americans are fucking crazy when it comes to science and stuff like that. And I agree. I don't get to. I'm not positing people's attitudes are changing. I'm giving you reasons to believe people's attitudes will change because this makes them a more sympathetic actor. But I want to ask you something, because I really do think that your language is like a little bit devaluing the stuff that I've said for no real reason. The question I want to, I think rhetoric's unpersuasive. If I ever judge you, that's the, but no, let me ask you, are you okay with children in schools being taught to follow the rules?
Sure, I'm fine with that.
All right, and so accepting discipline and punishment and authority and stuff like that. Obviously not to ad infinitum, but to a reasonable degree.
To a reasonable degree, yes. There are limits.
Yeah, of course. Obviously, they don't have to kiss the teacher's feet or something gross like that.
Or they don't have to take a pill that makes them obedient either.
Well, no, this is the thing I'm going to point out here. Even to a reasonable degree, that's still almost akin to indoctrination. Because if you think about it, kids go to school 5 days a week, 6 hours a day. How many was it? 40 weeks a year in Australia. I don't know what it's like in America. For 13 years. And during that time, they're basically taught every day conformity in their uniforms, conforming to the rules. That is teaching them and functionally brainwashing them to be adherent to the laws of the society. Now, some people slip through the cracks. This is a pill that just brings them onto the same level of everyone else, and is just like a different method. So instead of brainwashing, which is I understand is an intense term, but that is a reasonable way to describe what happens in schools. Yeah. This is virtually the same as well.
I don't know about that. I mean, maybe your schools are different, right? And the crazy American schools are pretty much just kids show up and they go to a series of classes, and the classes teach them English or mathematics or spelling or whatever it happens to be. There's not a whole lot of brainwashing goes on. You are supposed to follow the rules of the class, But it's not like every class has the same rules. Different teachers have different rules, different attitudes about student behavior. Different schools have different rules. Some of them have uniforms, some of them don't.
But they're all reasonably the same. Like,
Not really.
you can't shout over the teacher, for example, or you've got to put your hand up. Like, obviously there are deviations.
They're all functional to the purpose of the classroom, which is to provide the instruction on whatever the subject is.
Yeah,
right?
and
that isn't brainwashing. That's just behaving in a reasonable way in the context in which you find themselves, right?
Yes.
It's okay to walk around naked in your home. It's maybe not okay to walk around naked at Times Square. So there's a contextual difference in behavior. You have to learn some of these things as you grow up.
Yes, that's my point.
That's very different than brainwashing. Brainwashing is really to create a situation in which people don't see any other alternative. Where in a typical like cult, they say that everything we say is true and everything anybody else says is a lie. Not, hey, well, you're in this classroom, you have to follow the class rules. This is very different.
Let me ask you, what is the reasonable alternative that a Year 5 student has other than to follow the rules?
Reasonable Year 5 student has other than to follow the rules.
Let me rephrase.
Well, their parents could put them into a private school. They could be homeschooled.
That's not what the child doesn't have that choice. Like,
the child doesn't have the choice. Yeah, no. Well, their choice is to get punished. They get kicked out of school if they're problematic enough.
Yeah, and then what happens to the kid?
Well, then what happens? Who knows? I mean, any number of things could happen.
They have to go back to another school and they have to learn to follow the rules. And
maybe or
they basically get forced into it. No. If you're in primary school, right, you basically get forced.
Yeah, but it's not for. Maybe not. I mean, they try to. A lot of kids in the United States, kids can just get dropouts and never finish high school, right?
I'm talking about primary school.
I guess kids could get kicked out of primary school too. It happens on very rare occasions. But most people manage to figure it out, right? It's not that hard.
Right. Exactly.
But it doesn't turn you into a robot. It doesn't make you incapable of rebelling against authority. It just means you eventually capitulated.
It almost functionally does, because very few people rebel against authority.
I do it all the time.
Well, that's why I said very few people. Like, obviously, criminals still exist. The thing I'm pointing out here is that the state shapes the way in which you see the world because you have to follow rules. This is almost no different because it just makes them follow the rules of violent crimes. And to be honest, I really want to bring up again, this means they have shorter prison sentences, and thus they're not away from their families. So you have less broken homes, you have less single mothers and single fathers trying to support kids on a single salary. They're more likely to get a job when they come back out because they're not seen as someone who's going to like rob their store or assault their customers. Like, to be honest, it is really.
Why have them serve any prison sentence at all?
Pardon?
Why have them serve any prison sentence at all if that's a benefit? You could give them the pill, they could walk out the next day.
Well, there is still some retributive aspect. So, for example, like when a kid, so the argument I made about people being more sympathetic, it obviously has a limit. Like, I'm going to make them sympathetic in that they'll never commit the crime again, but people are still grumpy about the stuff that they've done. Thus, there is some retributive aspect, but I severely limit the need for as much of a retributive aspect because people overcompensate in that retribution because they really don't think that rehabilitation is going to occur. A good example of that is in Australia. We've got this thing called the one punch laws, which is just basically like people at clubs and stuff would drink and then punch people in the back of the neck and they'd like hit the ground and die immediately. And there was like a law passed in New South Wales, the state that I live, for them to have like a minimum sentence of like 20 years or something really absurd like that because people were really angry about the stuff that was happening. Now, they're less, and obviously they'd go out and repeat it. Now, if you can just stop them from repeating it, people are less likely to be angry in the future, and thus the retributive impact is less important.
Interesting. I like that you've adopted sort of a compromise position here. Although, because what I'm trying to point out is that there is a sort of a disconnect. If you let people out early, quote unquote, right, then the victims of these violent crimes are going to feel cheated that an unjust situation happened, right? If you're not letting them out early, then you end up into a situation of cruel and unusual punishment where somebody becomes one of these Sheeple Class, right? Because they've already served their time, only because we're worried about their reoffense, which is a measure beyond what we would normally consider just punishment. So one or the other, you end up with this kind of situation where somebody's not going to be happy based on one of these principles or the other.
No. So principles are not absolute. For example, you could have the principle for free speech, but that doesn't mean you get to say whatever you want at any time. The government still limits it in some cases. These are also principles that intersect, and I've found a more reasonable intersection for them. So for one, I don't think you've demonstrated at all that these are like a Sheeple class, given that almost everyone is the Sheeple class of not committing, not breaking the law.
That's not true. No, because like I said, most people operate with these emotions. It's not like they have special low levels of emotions. They're just able to rationally control. They have a mechanism by which we can understand that we would like to kill somebody, but we decide not to do it for rational reasons, understanding. So, and this is very different. They become incapable of these activities.
No, that's not the argument. The argument,
but if they don't become incapable of these activities, then you can't guarantee the benefits to society, and if you can't guarantee the benefits to society, you can't guarantee the trust that people are supposed to be able to have in this.
I agree, but that's not what I said. I didn't say that they wouldn't be incapable of committing these crimes. The argument that I made was that if no one else is committing these crimes, these people are also not committing these crimes. It's really unclear what the harm is of them being like unable to resist, especially when I pointed out other ways in which they can resist. For example, the cold and calculating way. But that's not. That's
a different argument than what I was just making.
I know, because you didn't listen to it when I said it before, which is what I was trying to point out. But then you kept saying over. But the thing I wanted to respond to is like the intersection stuff. You're like, someone's still going to be grumpy. That's actually not true. If you listen to a lot of like families of victims of murders and violent crimes, the stuff that they always say, they're like, we want him or her to go away just so they don't do it to someone else. Like it's obviously the retributive aspect, but the big overriding thing is that they don't want someone else to feel the pain that they're feeling right now. So this does stop it and means that it kind of like satisfies that desire that they have.
Maybe. It really depends. Different people have different motivations. Yeah, some people just simply want to see them bleed with their own hands, right? I mean, there are people who have a violent desire to see another person suffer for the pain that they caused.
It's most people. Like I invite you just Google it. Like, listen to what people say. It's almost always. I
have listened to plenty of victims.
Yeah, it's like obviously there are always deviants from the norm, but that you don't make laws around the deviants. You make laws around the norm.
But we have norms of justice, right? Which is for a particular crime or activity, there's a certain amount of punishment that served. And also under justice, there's an idea of culpability. So, for instance, if somebody is incapable of understanding the difference between right and wrong kind of a situation, they have lesser punishment. Sometimes they're considered not guilty of the crime, depends on what the crime is. And in this situation, we're generally altering somebody so that at the end of the procedure, they're no longer the person that was before the procedure. Before the procedure, they were a person with an uncontrolled emotional system, right? And so they did this crime and they're a danger to society. After you give them the pill, they're no longer apparently a danger to society, in which case they're no longer the person who committed the crime or the type of person who would commit such a crime.
So let me ask. Let me ask. Your regular rehabilitative methods, which often fail, but when they do succeed, it's still a new person who is not capable of committing the crime and is no longer a danger to society because they don't have this uncontrollable rage. What's the difference?
The difference is they've served a full sentence in their prison. That it hasn't subverted justice in some fashion in order to give them this pill or to make this change in them.
But how is it subverting justice when the sentences we have right now are over the top retributive because we are unable to rehabilitate? It's kind of like overcompensation.
That may be the case for those people, but I suppose that these are people who are considered to be unredeemable in some fashion. Often.
Well, now they are redeemable. Is my point? Why would you segment someone to being unredeemable for the rest of their life because they've been born with a genetic or psychological predisposition to be angry? That seems fun.
Well, now. Right. Well, here's a counter proposal: is that if you allowed people to take these pills voluntarily, if they existed, and they choose to do so, right? Then you could make that part of an option that people have. If they choose to do it, then there's no violation of rights. They gain the benefits that they have. They could be eligible for early parole or release, that sort of thing. However, if they choose not to take them, then they follow the normal mechanisms, and they stay in prison for the appropriate amount of time at which we feel justice has been served, but you avoid a lot of these other problems. It becomes voluntary choice. You don't have to worry about cruel and unusual punishment. You don't have to worry about abrogating, libertarian principles. You can simply make it a possible reposition they can have.
Hear me out. In the first start of this debate, you're like, the thing that separates rehabilitation by counseling is that they have some choice in it, that they have to like learn to deal with it themselves. And you're now proposing a choice thing. So one, that still means you have the sheeple harm of which obviously your side can't support.
But they would have self-selected it rather than being.
But we don't allow people to self-select into killing themselves. But regardless, like this is the important thing I want to say, is that if choice is the important thing, why don't more criminals choose to be rehabilitated well by counseling? I would posit that's because they can't, because it's not an active choice that they can make because of the way in which their brain functions. This protects those people.
But they could choose to take the pills. I mean, we're saying that they have difficulty controlling their emotions, not a question of that they don't desire to do so.
Why would they choose the pills and yet not choose counseling?
Because it makes it easier to go through the counseling.
No, obviously you wouldn't.
They wouldn't need the counseling anymore, right?
Right, exactly. But like, why are they choosing? It was fun, man. It was fun.
All right, take care.